Every system has an architecture. Most people see the facade. This is what's underneath. April 24th, 2026, the Treasury Secretary of the United States, Scott Bessent, stood before reporters and said this: "Many of our Gulf allies are asking for currency swap lines, many." When the Treasury Secretary of the United States uses that word, he means the architecture was finished before Washington noticed. $24 trillion moved through this system last year, up 43%. The dollar wasn't attacked, it was bypassed. By the time Washington noticed, the exit was operational. Money, power, collapse. The public story is consistent. You can pull it from any major desk. CNBC, Bloomberg, the Atlantic Council briefings, the IMF reserve composition reports. Yuan internationalization is failing. The dollar still holds 58% of global FX reserves. 88% of all forex transactions touch the dollar. Talk of a BRICS currency is fantasy. The dollar's network effect is too deep, too embedded, too convenient to dislodge. This story is not wrong, it is incomplete. It measures the right metrics for the wrong question, it measures what the dollar already is. It does not measure what is being built next to it. Power has an architecture, it can be diagrammed. That is what we do here, so let us diagram what was built while the public conversation was looking elsewhere. Begin with the machinery itself. CIPS, the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, launched by the People's Bank of China in 2015. Its volume that year was zero. In 2024, CIPS processed $24.47 trillion in cross-border settlements, up 43% year over year, 8.22 million transactions, 1,683 participants in 124 countries. These are not Chinese estimates, these are figures published by FXC Intelligence and the PBOC, sourced and time-stamped. For comparison, SWIFT, the dominant cross-border messaging system since the 1970s, settles in 2 to 5 days. CIPS, when paired with mBridge, settles in 23 seconds, not minutes, seconds. The difference is not incremental, it is structural. Then look at who plugged in Singapore's 3 systemic banks, UOB in June 2024, OCBC in September 2024, DBs in September 2025. These are not peripheral institutions. DBs is the largest bank in Southeast Asia. Singapore is the financial hub with the closest US relationship in the region. Singapore's 3 systemic banks just plugged in as direct participants. The question isn't why China built this. The question is why the bank with the closest US relationship in Asia signed up and what they saw coming. Now look at mBridge, the multi-CBDC bridge built by the Bank for International Settlements with the central banks of China, Hong Kong, Thailand, and the UAE. Cumulative settlement volume by January 2026, $55.5 billion in 4,047 transactions, 2,500 times growth from its 2022 pilot. 95% of the settlement volume denominated in yuan. Hold that figure, we will return to it. Russia was the test run. In February 2022, the United States and the European Union cut major Russian banks off from SWIFT. The expectation in Washington was disruption sufficient to constrain Russian behavior. What happened instead was a controlled experiment in dollar bypass at scale. Pre-2022, the yuan represented less than 2% of Russian foreign trade settlement. By the second half of 2025, according to the Russian Central Bank and confirmed by Finance Minister Siluanov in November, the breakdown looked like this: the ruble at 40%, the yuan at 30%, other national currencies filling the rest. 99.1% of Russia-China trade now settles in national currencies, not in dollars, not even in euros. Notice what this means. They did not replace the dollar in Russian trade with the yuan. They replaced the dollar with a network of national currencies, with the yuan as one node among several. The architecture proved that the system worked under stress. That was the lesson Beijing extracted. That was the lesson the rest of the world watched. Russia was the test. Saudi Arabia is the proof. And the document Bessent received last week from the UAE central bank governor explains what the proof means. The petrodollar arrangement signed in 1974 between the United States and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Saudi crude priced and settled in dollars. Saudi surplus recycled into US Treasury Securities, the arrangement that more than any single instrument anchored the dollar's role as the unit of account for global energy. The 1974 agreement expired in June 2024. It was not renewed. There was no announcement. There was no ceremony. The arrangement simply lapsed. In the months that followed, the disclosed share of Saudi crude exports to China, settled in yuan, rose to approximately 45%. Sourced from Fortune's reporting in April 2026 and corroborated by Sarsen Funds, the largest oil producer in the Gulf is now invoicing nearly half of its largest customer in a non-dollar currency. The petrodollar did not collapse, it was allowed to age out. Then, November 19, 2025, Sheikh Mansour bin Zayed and the governors of both central banks executed the first cross-border CBDC transaction on the Gzera platform, UAE-China real settlement, not a pilot, not a sandbox, live infrastructure. Then April 20th, 2026, the UAE Central Bank Governor delivered a document to Treasury Secretary Bessent and to the Federal Reserve. The contents have not been published. The fact of the delivery was reported by Fortune 4 days later. On April 24th, Bessent acknowledged that many Gulf allies were asking for currency swap lines. Now compare two networks. The U.S. Federal Reserve maintains 14 swap lines worth roughly $560 billion. The People's Bank of China currently maintains 32 bilateral currency swap agreements totaling more than 4.5 trillion yuan, two networks, different scale, different geometry, both functioning. Here's where the story breaks. Yuan dominance was never the goal. Read that again. Yuan dominance was never the goal. mBridge is currency agnostic by design. CIPS works with multiple currencies. The 95% yuan share on mBridge exists because China is the largest counterparty in the system, not because the architecture privileges the yuan. The exit is not to the yuan. The exit is to a network where the choice of which currency to use no longer requires permission from New York. Weaponize a system enough and its users will build their own exits. This is what the observer sees that the desk economist misses. The strategic objective was never to make the yuan the new dollar. The strategic objective was to make the question of which currency to settle in a routine technical decision rather than a geopolitical one. To take settlement infrastructure off the list of things Washington can leverage. The yuan benefits as the largest node, but the architecture would still work if the yuan disappeared tomorrow. That is the design. Money, power, collapse. But the dollar is still 58% of global FX reserves, still 88% of all Forex transactions. Bessent's quote could just be diplomatic posturing. The system can't really be replaced. The inertia is too deep. Half a century of dollar invoicing, dollar pricing, dollar contracts, dollar habits. The euro-dollar market alone is larger than most national economies. Reserves take decades to shift. Networks reinforce themselves. Path dependence is real. The twist explains the architecture, but it doesn't explain why the dollar's defenders are pointing to the wrong numbers. Here is why reserves and transactions measure dollar-denominated assets that already exist. Settlement infrastructure measures what gets built next. These are different metrics. Only one of them is being tracked by the dominant analysis. In 2010, SWIFT processed 88% of cross-border payments. CIPS volume in 2015 was zero. Today, CIPS clears $24 trillion annually and grows at 43% per year. The dollar's stock dominance and the dollar system's flow dominance are different categories. Stock measures what was accumulated. Flow measures what is being routed. Stock is the past tense. Flow is the present tense, becoming the future. This is the gap in the public conversation. Washington watches the FX reserve composition tables and concludes that nothing has changed. Beijing watches the settlement throughput numbers and knows that everything has. Both are looking at real data. Only one is looking at the data that determines what comes next. Explanation after the fact is a comfort. The dollar's defenders explain the past. The architecture anticipates the future. That asymmetry is the entire story. Now reread Bessent's quote with the architecture in view. Many of our Gulf allies are asking for currency swap lines, not asking for dollar liquidity, asking for swap lines, the instrument by which a central bank routes around dollar dependency in a stress event. The Treasury Secretary of the United States is acknowledging that allied central banks are now treating swap line access as a hedge against the dollar system itself. That is the admission. That is what was buried under the diplomatic language. January 2026, the PBOC opened its Digital Yuan International Operations Center in Shanghai, a center dedicated only to international circulation, separate from domestic. February 1st, 2026, CIPS revised rules took effect. Payment versus payment, delivery versus payment, digital yuan integration, all under one governance framework. September 2026, the BRICS Summit in New Delhi. CBDC interoperability is on the formal agenda, not as a future state aspiration, as a concrete protocol question. By the time Washington noticed, the exit was operational. The architecture works because yuan dominance was never the goal. The dollar still circulates, the dollar still invoices, the dollar still settles. It just no longer has the only door. The system keeps moving, so do we. Until next time, question the architecture. Money power collapse.